Linux is no longer the underdog story people used to whisper about in tech forums and late-night discussions. It has quietly crossed a line that Windows simply cannot follow anymore. And what we are witnessing right now is not just competition between operating systems, but a complete shift in how computing itself is defined, owned, and controlled, because for decades, Windows dominated the world by being the default, the pre-installed, the unavoidable system that powered homes, offices, schools, and enterprises. But Linux has evolved beyond being an alternative and has now become a statement, a philosophy, and increasingly a practical choice that challenges everything Microsoft built its empire on. And this transformation did not happen overnight. It has been building silently through years of community-driven innovation, open-source collaboration, and a growing frustration among users who are starting to realize that control over their own devices matters more than ever in a world driven by data, privacy, and artificial intelligence.
What makes this moment so different is that Linux is no longer just for developers or tech enthusiasts. It has become polished, user-friendly, visually appealing, and most importantly, powerful enough to replace Windows for a majority of use cases. And this is where the line has been crossed, because Windows still operates within a closed ecosystem where decisions are made centrally. Updates are pushed without full transparency, and users are often treated as passive participants, while Linux flips that entire model upside down by giving users full control over their systems, from the kernel itself to the smallest customization detail. And in a time where people are becoming increasingly aware of digital rights and privacy concerns, that level of control is not just attractive, it is becoming essential. If you look at how computing habits are changing in 2025, you will notice a major shift away from traditional desktop dominance toward a more flexible, cloud-integrated, and developer-driven environment. And Linux is perfectly positioned for this future because it already powers the backbone of the internet, from servers and cloud infrastructure to containers and supercomputers, meaning that Linux is not trying to catch up to the future, it is already running it. And Windows, despite its massive presence, is constantly trying to adapt to trends that Linux helped create, whether it is integrating Linux subsystems, supporting open-source tools, or attempting to replicate the flexibility that Linux distributions naturally provide. And then there is the explosion of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which has further widened the gap between Linux and Windows, because almost every major AI framework, development toolkit, and research environment is optimized for Linux, making it the default choice for developers, researchers, and companies working on the next generation of technology. And this is not just a technical advantage, it is a strategic one, because the operating system that developers prefer is often the one that shapes the future of software itself. And right now, that operating system is Linux, not Windows. Another key factor that shows how Linux has crossed this line is the rise of customization and modularity, where users no longer want a one-size-fits-all system, but instead prefer something that adapts to their needs. And Linux distributions offer exactly that, from lightweight systems that run on old hardware to advanced setups designed for high-performance computing, gaming, or cybersecurity. And this level of flexibility simply does not exist in the same way on Windows, which remains heavily standardized and controlled. And while that standardization once made Windows easy to use, it now feels restrictive in a world where personalization is everything. Gaming, which used to be one of the strongest reasons to stick with Windows, is also undergoing a transformation that is surprisingly favorable to Linux. Thanks to technologies like compatibility layers and the growing support from major platforms, Linux gaming is no longer a niche experiment, but a rapidly improving ecosystem that is starting to rival Windows in performance and compatibility. And as more developers embrace cross-platform tools and open standards, the gap continues to shrink, removing one of the last major barriers that kept users tied to Windows. Privacy is another area where Linux has gained a significant advantage, because unlike Windows, which is often criticized for telemetry and data collection practices, Linux distributions are typically transparent about what they do and do not collect. And for many users, this transparency builds trust, especially in a time when data has become one of the most valuable resources in the world, and as governments, organizations, and individuals become more cautious about digital surveillance and data security, Linux presents itself as a safer, more trustworthy option. And then there is the issue of cost, which cannot be ignored, because Linux is free, not just in terms of price, but also in terms of freedom, allowing users to install, modify, and distribute it without restrictions, while Windows continues to rely on licensing models that can become expensive, especially for businesses and large-scale deployments. And this economic factor becomes even more important in developing regions where access to affordable technology can have a huge impact on education and innovation, making Linux not just a technical choice, but a socially impactful one. What is particularly interesting is how even Microsoft itself seems to acknowledge this shift, as seen in its increasing involvement with open source projects and its efforts to integrate Linux into its own ecosystem. And while this might appear as a sign of cooperation, it also highlights the reality that Windows alone is no longer enough to meet the demands of modern computing, and instead of competing directly, Microsoft is finding ways to coexist with the very system that once threatened its dominance, which is a clear indication that the balance of power is changing. The future of operating systems is also being shaped by hardware evolution, where devices are becoming more diverse, from traditional desktops and laptops to embedded systems, IoT devices, and edge computing platforms. And Linux has a natural advantage here because it can run on virtually any hardware architecture, making it incredibly versatile, while Windows remains more limited in its adaptability. And as the number of connected devices continues to grow, this flexibility becomes a critical factor in determining which operating system will lead the next generation of technology. Education is another domain where Linux is gaining ground, as more institutions recognize the value of teaching students with open-source tools that encourage learning, experimentation, and collaboration, rather than locking them into proprietary ecosystems. And this creates a new generation of users who are already comfortable with Linux, further accelerating its adoption and influence in the years to come. When you combine all these factors together, it becomes clear that Linux has not just improved, it has fundamentally changed the rules of the game. And the line it has crossed is not just technical, but philosophical, representing a shift from control to freedom, from closed systems to open collaboration, and from passive consumption to active participation. And this is something Windows, by its very design and business model, cannot fully replicate. The question now is not whether Linux will replace Windows completely, but rather how far this shift will go and how quickly it will happen. Because while Windows still holds a dominant position in many areas, the momentum behind Linux is undeniable, and as more users, developers, and organizations recognize its advantages, the gap continues to narrow, bringing us closer to a future where the choice of operating system is no longer dictated by default, but by preference and purpose. This is the moment where the future of operating systems starts to become visible, not as a single winner, but as a landscape where flexibility, openness, and user empowerment take center stage. And Linux is leading that transformation in a way that Windows simply cannot match, not because it lacks resources or influence, but because it is built on a fundamentally different vision of what computing should be. And as we move forward into an era defined by artificial intelligence, decentralized technologies, and an ever-growing demand for digital independence, Linux stands as a symbol of what is possible when innovation is driven by community rather than control. And whether you are a developer, a student, a gamer, or just an everyday user, this shift will eventually affect how you interact with technology, because the operating system you use is no longer just a tool, it is a statement about who controls your digital life. So when we say that Linux has crossed a line Windows cannot follow, it is not about one system being better than the other in every single way. It is about recognizing that the future is being shaped by different priorities, and Linux happens to align perfectly with those priorities, making it not just relevant but essential in the years ahead. And that is why this moment matters more than ever, because it marks the beginning of a new chapter in the story of computing, one where the rules are no longer written by a single company, but by a global community working together to build something better, something freer, and something truly transformative.